Hello, everybody. Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this special forum on Islamophobia. My name is Edina Lekovic, and I am a proud board member and co-founder of NewGround, a Muslim-Jewish partnership for change. And this special convening is being convened because of the hot topics that are going on and important conversations that are taking place inside of each of our communities that deserve to be surfaced, centered, and picked apart so that more people can have them and that we can spread these conversations forward in a thoughtful way. So we thank all of you for being with us tonight. This is a tough subject that we know that we are convening on, and the current and evolving landscape of Muslim activities, anti-Muslim activities here in the around the world is paralleling what we're seeing with the rise in anti-Semitism here and around the world. Myself and our guests have been working on the front lines of since after 9/11 and most of us since before 9/11, but seeing the rise of Islamophobia is something that we saw spike while there was a feeling that anti-Semitism might be lower and in the background. Today in 2023, we see the fire raging in both of our communities. And what is on the line is the lives of both of our communities and all of the people within our communities. So the stakes are high. One of the many things that Muslim and Jewish Angelenos have in common is knowing we can be subjected to identity-based harassment, discrimination, or violence at any moment in time, whether we're in our neighborhood, our workplace, in public places, while we're with our families, or scrolling on social media feeds, or consuming news media even. We've witnessed attacks that are motivated by hate and white supremacy all around the country, not just from deranged individuals and hateful individuals, but even from the halls of power. And I'm sure we can all think of examples. As an interfaith organization, we often explore the intersecting experiences of our two communities and our two extremely diverse communities of faith. But sometimes, as in today's program, we find it valuable to take a deep dive to better understand the depth of experience in one community or the other. Today's program is designed to explore the experiences, fears, internal debates, and nuances that are facing Muslim communities as we face Islamophobia in 2023. Our guests today are inspiring and effective leaders with decades of experience tackling Islamophobia. They will both help us understand both current trends in Islamophobia as well as the fault lines that complicate our mutual commitment to eradicating fear, hate, and suspicion. They are Dalia Mogahed of the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding and Najeeba Syeed of Augsburg University in Minnesota. Holding this conversation on Zoom today enables us to have a recording for future alumni and leader gatherings, as well as to put it on our YouTube and social media. And so we appreciate that our guests have agreed to that to further the conversation and the education. This program will last an hour. We respect time, at least we try to in every event. And so you can count on that. You will have the option of staying on for additional conversation, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment. During this conversation together that I have with Dalia and Najeeba, the chat will be disabled so that we can keep our focus on our guests and on our own thoughts and reactions to our guests and questions. We invite you to please share your questions instead, and the NewGround staff will feed those questions to me. So that is still available to you, and we hope to get as many of your questions answered as possible. After we've heard it all from Dalia and Najeeba during our conversation, we hope that you'll be left wanting to talk about it. And so we invite those of you interested in talking to join a small group breakout room with a skilled facilitator and a few of your fellow attendees here today. The breakout rooms will not be recorded. Again, the breakout rooms will not be recorded so that there can be frank, candid, off the record conversations. And you will have the option of joining different types of breakout rooms, which I'll tell you about at the end. So with that, let's meet our guests. Our first guest is Dalia Mogahed. Dalia is a longtime researcher, published author, and international voice on Islam and Muslim life. She's the director of research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, where she leads the organization's pioneering research and thought leadership programs on American Muslims. Dalia is also the former executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, where she led the analysis of surveys of Muslim communities worldwide, With Dr. John Esposito, she co-authored the truly groundbreaking and definitive book that defied the post 9/11 era Islamophobia for readers worldwide. And that book was called Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. And it was released in 2007, which, if you can believe, was 16 years ago. 2 years later, President Barack Obama appointed Dalia to his newly formed President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, which was a huge feather in the cap for all of our communities, and especially Muslim women across the country. And she was followed later, I think in the next administration, by our very own Aziza Hassan. So in good company here. Dalia has also testified before the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations about U.S. engagement with Muslim communities. She made an iconic appearance on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, which I encourage you to watch. And her 2016 TED Talk was named one of the top TED Talks of that year. Finally, Dalia is the CEO of Mogahed Consulting. Welcome, Dalia.
Thank you so much, Edina.
You're so welcome. We also have with us Najeeba Syeed, who is the El-Hibri Endowed Chair and Professor at Augsburg University, where she also serves as the Executive Director of the Augsburg Interfaith Institute. In the short time since she joined the university, she and the multi-faith network there were joined by the governor's wife in launching their initiative on Islamophobia. This is the governor of Minnesota. Najeeba has been a professor, expert practitioner, and public speaker for the last 2 decades in conflict resolution, interfaith studies, mediation, education, deliberative democracy, social, gender, and racial equity, all of the questions of our day. Earlier in her career, she was the first Muslim Executive Director of the Western Justice Center, and more recently served as Chief of Staff to a member of the LA City Council before she went on to her current role at the university. She's also played a leading role in the American Academy of Religion, where she was an advisor to several masters and doctoral, and she was an advisor to several masters and doctoral students, published widely in her fields of study, including work as an editor on women's studies. And while occupying the position of professor, she was the executive director of the Center for Global Peace Building, running public-facing programs in diplomacy, international human rights, and LA-based urban peacemaking. So if we don't have the right guests with us, I can't imagine a better pair for the conversation that we're about to have. So welcome to you both. And again, thank you both for sharing your time and energy with the NewGround community here in LA and beyond.
Thank you so much, Edina. It's really a pleasure to be here.
You're so welcome. So the format for today is that I'm going to start out by asking a few questions to you both, the same question to both of you. I will probably get through 3 or 4 questions, hoping that we have a few minutes for each of you at a time. And then we'll turn it over to our audience questions. So our hope is that the first 40 minutes or so will be our own conversation, and then it will be supplemented by your questions. So keep them coming all throughout, and they will be handed to me, and we'll have a good period of time to be able to answer the questions that are coming from those attending. And it looks like we have almost 75 participants with us now. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. So ready to get started? Okay, so this is not a cheery topic, but I bring cheer to it because the work that we do to save our own lives and the lives of our children and our future generations, to me, is joyful work. And even though we have to sludge through hate, fear, and discrimination to get to that future, it's a joy to work for the future. And that's a reality that's set in since I became a parent 12 years ago. I didn't really have it beforehand. So that's a confession more than a celebration. But I want to ask each of you to start by sharing what your own experience or connection to Islamophobia is beyond the obvious, and how did this become a field of work and or expertise for you? May I ask you to go first, Dalia?
Sure, absolutely. So first of all, thank you all who are attending today for giving up time from your evening to talk about such a cheery subject. It's a pleasure to be here. My connection to the topic of Islamophobia really started before it was a word we used. It was all the way back in college, where I was the president of the Bosnia Relief Committee And I was a college activist working on anti-Muslim genocide, literally at the time. We didn't call it Islamophobia, but it was Islamophobia can take the form of genocide, and that was an example of it. And so Bosnia was where I became very personally involved in this topic, and I was an activist around it. I raised money around it as a college activist. I wrote about it in the college newspaper, and it really galvanized and activated and mobilized so many people in America, and in the Muslim community, and our, as well as our allies, around this question of what happens when hate becomes lethal, not just immoral. And after I graduated from college, I led a pretty private life as a post-engineering undergrad student working for corporate America. But then the tragic and horrific events of 9/11 took place, and I was again pulled into a more public role in an attempt to build bridges and educate.
So, it's interesting because I've been a professor now for over 15 years, and usually I answer these questions from a very academic, analytical place. And I thought I would just share with you more recently. There was a time period in particular that really struck me. It was in 2016 and right before the presidential election. If you study Islamophobia, we know that it spikes really noticeably around the election cycle. Whether we do, as I have done, community-based hate crimes work or intervention, or you're doing the empirical work that Dalia has done. So I just wanted to share with you a couple of incidents that happen around a time period. My mosque at that time in Los Angeles, this was when my children were there every Sunday, and I was very active in the mosque. It was a mosque that was really particularly supportive of women speaking, and so we were targeted by a man that was later found to have a stash of weapons. And I think and I ended up on the public safety committee of the mosque, and there's a full-time Muslim school that runs at the mosque, and I had to accompany some consultants and our community leaders to having our children do in-person shooting training. And then after it became public that we were threatened, I gave the first public talk about spirituality and healing. And I was thinking, here we are opening up again, and we've been threatened. And then close in time to this incident, I was asked to speak at a university, and I was speaking at their baccalaureate, speaking about, of all topics, Islam and peace building. And I got a call from the university, and they said, Najeeba, we need to talk to you. We've received a threat that if you speak, there is a parent who was so upset to see a visibly Muslim woman on the invitation that we have done an investigation and found that this person has a history of and access to weapons. We cannot assure your safety. And this was an event that I would have at that time taken my children to, that I was ready to have. I have now a 17 and 15-year-old, but they would have been with me in the audience. And at that time, they were much younger. So I think of it really in terms of Islamophobia. I thought about this time period where the place that I worshiped, that my children worshiped in, didn't feel safe. And for the first time, I did something that I always advise people not to do, which is self-regulate based on fear of Islamophobia. And I didn't speak. I didn't give that public address. And I was silenced because the university said, we cannot assure your safety if you do speak. And in both cases, it was really very clear. Sometimes it's not clear that it's a Muslim identity. It's not clear that it's, that part of my identity that's being challenged. There are so many reasons that my identity could be and who I am in my embodiment. But I wanted to share those stories with you because I think the sense of safety, and I don't talk about this very often, And I've been, you know, kind of in the public square in the work that I've done for almost, I should say 30 years now, but it really struck me as a mother. So I wanted to kind of speak from that place as a mother of 2 Muslim children, as a community leader, as a professor. Every place felt infiltrated in that time period. And it was a very, it just made me incredibly sad. It wasn't even anger, it was just sadness, and obviously protecting my children. But I think if you want a real example of what it means to deal with Islamophobia and a lived experience, that's just a snapshot of about a year and a half.
Thank you for sharing that, Najeeba, and also Dalia. You both present that combination of the personal experiences of growing up, you know, in Muslim families who were active and joyous and grounded and all of those things, and that being disrupted and shattered with the reality of 9/11 and everything that's happened since. And thank you, excuse me, Najeeba, for taking us to the more recent eras, because yes, every political cycle we have flare-ups, and we could count on it for Islamophobia, and certainly we're seeing that with anti-Semitism as well these days. So for both of you then, we go from your lives and experiences to, let's look at or share with us your knowledge and expertise. Where do you see how do you see where the roots of Islamophobia came from or are coming from today? I invite you to handle it either way. And how do you currently see Islamophobia manifesting? If you could share examples of what you have been witnessing, both firsthand and on the national, international stage, we would welcome that.
I can start. It's such an important question, the root cause, or where does Islamophobia come from? And I think that, you know, what I'll do first is to maybe dispel what many of us think is the cause, which is horrific terrorist attacks like 9/11. Most Muslims, if you ask them, you know, why is there Islamophobia, they'll say, oh, you know, 9/11 did it. And that was certainly what I thought until I looked at the empirical data. And what you find in the data is that public opinion did not go negative after 9/11 at all. It was quite the opposite. It actually improved slightly from right before 9/11 to right after, in terms of public opinion and their views of Muslims. Where public opinion against Muslims started to get much more negative is in the run-up to the Iraq War. And as has already been mentioned, it spikes in terms of negativity around election cycles, not around violence, even when carried out by someone who claims to be a Muslim. Why this is so important is because it gives us a clue as to where Islamophobia does in fact come from. And it comes from greed. Why do I say that? Because racist ideas don't produce bad policies. Bad policies produce racist ideas to justify them. So the run-up to the Iraq War required manufacturing consent for a war that Americans would not have otherwise agreed to. And you can find this really clearly in the way public opinion shifted after 9/11 to the Iraq War. And you can track it in the way the media was speaking about Muslims. You can see political statements and how they shifted and how they changed. Where the eve of the Iraq War, the majority of Americans believed there was a direct connection between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden, which of course we know there was not. For there to be more than 70% of our public believe something that is empirically false on the eve of such a monumental day as the beginning of this disastrous war. And today, the majority of Americans thought it was a mistake, think it's a mistake. So Islamophobia is a tool of political manipulation. And you can track it around election cycles, same thing. Why is it spiking around election cycles, but didn't change at all after the Boston bombing? because it is used as a tool to drum up support for specific candidates and specific policies. Muslims are being scapegoated and instrumentalized to justify certain policies that are in the interest of powerful people.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'll address it, and that's, thank you so much, Dalia, for your insights. I'll address it a little bit more from a historical perspective. And one of the things that we find that Islamophobia shares with anti-Semitism is that many of the tropes that are used against Muslims are not new. They have existed for hundreds of years because Islam and Muslims have interacted with other cultures and religions from the beginning of the inception of all these traditions. And so I just want to point out that sometimes the tropes that are utilized are ones that were utilized historically in other forms of violence or to justify violence against Muslims. So unfortunately, some of them find their basis theologically in a religious interpretation that casts Muslims or Islam as less than. Often the challenge is that Islam or Muslims are not given the currency of being an actual religion or a religious group. And that is, there are many tropes that we can trace that to. And I just wanted to kind of put that out there, that these are not new. Very often, if you listen or you trace, you can find literature that echoes the tropes that are utilized now, because history does repeat itself, even though we're not always aware of that. So I wanted to point that out as well, that it's not a new phenomenon per se. It has a new name at this moment. But unfortunately, anti-Muslim violence has a history, as does other forms of biases, and those are drawn upon. And I wanted to kind of point out one thing. Whenever I intervene in conflicts around the world, I always ask two questions: is, do I have a place at your table, and am I in your future? And that is the reason I pose those questions, is that they're deeply embedded in how we view America as a democracy. And anything that, or any ideas, or most ideas that challenge America as a multiracial democracy also challenge it as a multi-religious democracy. Those are intertwined. So I wanted to point out that the idea of Islam as a foreign religion, Muslims as a foreign entity, is actually deeply embedded in anti-Black racism, because what it does is it negates the founding of this country with having a presence of Muslims in this land, and prior to the founding of this nation. So the kind of this questioning, or this performance, as we see now in many curricular initiatives around the country, to say that the United States is an origin that is not multiracial, or doesn't talk about the founding of this country and the dynamics that existed, inevitably also deny the presence of Muslims, particularly Muslims of African descent, on this land. So I wanted to point that out, that there is an inextricable link to anti-Black racism and Islamophobia. And in particular, I wanted to add that where we are in Minnesota, my students, who are mostly of African descent and Muslim, since we have one of the largest Somali populations in the world, often talk about, when they go to a panel on anti-Black racism, Islamophobia is not discussed, and they go to a panel on Islamophobia and anti-Black Blackness is not acknowledged. So I just wanted to point that out, the notion that it's only a religious form of discrimination, or discrimination based on one's religious identity, negates all of the other aspects that are intertwined with the story of America. And if the story of America is not told in its multiracial, multi-religious, inclusive history, we can't go forward with being in each other's futures if we don't acknowledge the past.
Thank you both for that. That compels me to ask you both if you could share an example or two of Islamophobia in your world, or the world right now, that are troubling to you.
Yeah, one that I wanted to share is actually really, it seems more subtle to me. So first of all, I've written a lot about the idea of Muslim women being what I call in my work embodiments or embodied interruptions, that when we walk into a space, even without declaring our religious identity, very often, and it's also in secular spaces, not just in other religions or other religious spaces. But I wanted to think a little bit here about Muslim youth, and something that really struck me was the impact of Islamophobia in our own hermeneutics of our own tradition. And this really struck me with working with, I do conflict resolution, education, and gang intervention work. And it really struck me in meeting Muslim youth around the country. And I would say, well, when do you turn to the Quran? When do you engage in your scripture? They say to prove that Islam is not violent. And I cannot tell you how many times I've heard that. And I thought, what an incredible experience to have, that you connect with your own spiritual text, your own spirituality, when you are on a defensive mode of operation. And I don't think that this is a violent form of Islamophobia, but it's that internalized Islamophobia that becomes the lens in which we practice our own tradition that worries me about its generational impact. And so even if hate crimes, hopefully will go down, that other forms of violence, whether it's violent speech, or a number of mosques also in Minnesota have been recently attacked, what happens when that's how we see our tradition? And what does that do to the development, the spiritual formation of a whole generation, now multiple generations of young people? And I wanted to put that out there because I think the impact of that kind of Islamophobia that becomes a characteristic of a spiritual experience, that is a really profoundly disturbing kind of phenomenon for me. And I don't really have much commentary on it, but to say that I've now noticed it again and again.
That's profound, Najeeba. I mean, you're talking about, that's the spiritual gutting. I mean, go ahead, Dalia.
It's so interesting that you started with that, Najeeba. So at ISPU, we've been doing a survey of American Muslim Jews, Catholics, Protestants, and within the Protestant group, white evangelicals, as well as non-affiliated Americans. And we started doing that survey in 2016. So we have a number of years. And one of the key findings of 2022 was internalized Islamophobia among especially young Muslims, where Islamophobia was inching downward among other groups, but it was inching upward among Muslims. And this idea of, I agree with you, I think this is one of the most destructive impacts of Islamophobia, is how young people have let it impact their identity, the way they think of themselves, the way they understand their faith. And it has generational repercussions. I'm going to, widen the lens a bit more from the individual now to society, because I do want to make sure that folks understand that Islamophobia has a lot in common with anti-Semitism, in that we experience Islamophobia on the societal level. We are the victims of hate crimes. We are the victims of white supremacist violence, scapegoating by, hate mongers and so forth, and right-wing radio. But where Islamophobia is a lot more similar to systemic racism is when we see it at the state level, where the state has more power to inflict Islamophobia than anyone else. And we see Islamophobia in things like the immigration system, in policing, in banking. So we just came out with a report literally called Banking While Muslim, where Muslims are repeatedly having their major issues with their banks and having their accounts closed for mysterious reasons that aren't explained, with no recourse. And it's wreaking havoc on their lives, on their businesses, on their organizations, and so forth. Even while seeking healthcare, there's there's an experience of Islamophobia among a significant portion of our community. So I want to make sure that folks understand that if I were to tell you the greatest and most damaging actor in terms of Islamophobia, in terms of the power to inflict harm, is the state. It's not private groups. It's not hate groups, as bad as they are and as dangerous as they are. It is the state. It's the border guard. It's the FBI. It's people, it's the way that folks are treated by the criminal justice system. And all of this is from empirical results around people reporting how they are treated in all of these different contexts.
Mm-hmm. It's a pivotal point because, I want to put on the table international politics, especially Europe, right? Like, look at how Islamophobia is also playing out there and how what that means for us here. So last week, France banned the wearing of abaya, or Muslim, the loose-fitting gowns that some Muslim women wear for modesty, in addition to the hijab or headscarf, and that being an example from overseas of an example where the state is involved. I think more recently here in the US, I don't know how much of this is happening anymore, but there was a whole period of time where anti-Sharia legislation was being proposed in state legislatures around the country, I believe a few dozen, if I'm not mistaken. And that was an example of how it could be institutionalized in a way that would be damaging. We have to move on to the next question, but Dalia, are there any do you have any concerns about any policies that are currently being considered on the national level here, or anything that you want to raise a flag about?
Most of the policies are a legacy of the last 20 years. There aren't new policies being floated that are of concern, except for something like the Muslim ban, which Trump is already, campaigning on. So that's a very easy and clear example of institutionalized Islamophobia that impacted millions of people. But all of these other policies, like the watch list, like the Patriot Act, that impacts people's lives in profound ways, while not making us more safe, right? It's a legacy that no one has the political will or moral courage to take and re-examine. So I think what we need to do is to put pressure on allies in government to re-examine these things, to take another look now 20 years after 9/11 and understand their real impact, and if they actually have done any good, and to really reconsider disassembling this apparatus.
Thank you for that. And that segues right into our next question, which is, what do you wish people understood about the most effective ways to address Islamophobia? Perhaps you could start, Najeeba.
Yeah, I wanted to speak also really briefly about the disproportionate impact that Islamophobia has had on women and in the gendered component of Islamophobia. I think you mentioned the abaya ban in France, and this continual kind of notion that Muslim women's bodies are these contested spaces, and the regulation of Muslim women's bodies as very often a reflection of what not just a policy, but a moral standpoint, and what's considered normative in a society, and how Muslim women's bodies become that place of regulation. So it's not just in France, there are many other countries in which these issues have come about, and Muslim women may not face it in a legislative stance, but after law school, I was applying for jobs, and I was told by many people, if you take off your hijab, this is like 2000, it's a long time ago. It was 2000 and around 2000, and then 9/11 happened obviously as well. But even before 9/11, I was told, you know, you don't want to be visibly Muslim. So I just wanted to point that out, that Muslim women's bodies, and there's also this concept of femo-nationalism, if people are not familiar with that. It's when Muslim women's bodies become a symbol for justifying violence against Muslims. And we saw that kind of an interest suddenly in Muslim women's rights when there was the declaration of war for Afghanistan, and it became somehow an interest, but then it didn't continue throughout the prosecution of that war. And I wanted to point that out because that's also a policy decision, but it's not always embedded in policy. It's the rhetoric that's used, the symbols that are used. And I think Muslim women are very familiar with sometimes being put out front and being subjected to being a subject of diversity, but then when you speak up, you're kind of put in the back or you are utilized. And I think I just wanted to share that with people. It does have a particular impact on Muslim women's bodies, both in the symbolic sense as well as in the very real policy sense. I think one of the things I would ask everyone to do is actually interrogate your own answer to this question: who or what does who is a Muslim to you? And I know that seems really simple, but very often we have a racialized image of a particular kind of a person that a Muslim is. I don't know what yours is, but in so much of the work that's been done on dehumanization and Islam, very often, and Islamophobia, the version of whatever that person is carrying is the version that is imposed on their interactions or their engagement or their understanding of Muslims. So I just wanted to point that out, that self-reflective process, that really digging deep into our own selves and saying, well, what do I carry with me? And sometimes those forms of Islamophobia are really subtle. One of the most dangerous forms of Islamophobia is to think that all Muslims practice or that we're unified in one ideology or interpretation of Islam. It seems like a very, innocuous thing, but in fact, that's what led to a lot of the anti-Sharia legislation, was the notion that Islam doesn't get the same treatment as other religions. De-exceptionalizing Islam from a particular kind of treatment, whether it's a legislative treatment or otherwise, is part of what I think all of us have to do work on. And I wanted to point that out. There is so often I'm put on panels and all the questions about peace and violence. I always tell people every religious tradition and every community has a possibility for violence or for peace. But very often I'm the one that's asked about cases of violence, and I'll point it out in the framing of the question. So it finds its way into scholarly places. And in fact, one of my Buddhist colleagues, he was laughing with me at one panel. He said, you have a public relations problem with Islam always being seen as peaceful, and I have a public relations problem with my religion with Islam being seen as violent. And he said, I have a public relations problem on the opposite end, where everyone always comes to the conversation, even in the academic sense, thinking that my tradition is always peaceful. And it was so fascinating that we were talking about this analytical framework. So at a very simple level, I think interrogating who and what and how one thinks about the category of Muslim and Islam, and de-exceptionalizing and moving to a place that you see, you listen, and you hear the diversity instead of imposing whatever it is you're carrying with you. So that deprogramming may take years. It may take some of us a lifetime, but I wanted to kind of put that out there, that the tropes that we carry are very strategic. They're very, they're funded as well. That you can talk about that too. So it is a deprogramming process at the individual and community level. And I would say, finally, for those of us that are in religious communities or have access to a pulpit or bima, it's not really what we say about each other in front of each other. It's what we say when the other community or person is not in the room. So are you thinking about what your children are learning about Muslims? Do you provide an example? Do you engage in a rhetoric and a form of a dialogic imagination for what and how Muslims are in your life. And I want to know that you're doing that when I'm not there and my kids are not there, because that's actually the most important space. And the same goes obviously with anti-Semitism, as I would commit to doing that as well. So I really just wanted to put that out there, that it's not just when we're together, we can out nice each other. It's actually when we're alone in our own communities, what we say has the most and longest lasting impact, especially those that have access to religious leadership and religious spaces.
So we've done research on lots of things having to do with Islamophobia, and it's linked to violence, and it's linked to bad policies. And I just want to reiterate that yes, Islamophobia is absolutely gendered, absolutely gendered. Muslim women bear the brunt of Islamophobic attacks, Islamophobic discriminatory experiences. And interestingly, and this is a surprise to me, we found that women who are visibly Muslim, who wear hijab, and women who aren't, were equally likely, believe it or not, equally likely to experience anti-Muslim discriminatory acts in their lives. And it's hard to understand that, but for some reason, Islamophobia is very, very gendered. And what is ironic is the most prevalent and widespread anti-Muslim trope is that of Muslims being especially misogynistic. Now, all communities have misogyny, but the idea is that Muslims are worse, and it's pathologized to our community, essentialized to our community, and so forth. And so it's at once people think Muslim women are oppressed and we should go to war to free them, but they're also the most attacked by Islamophobic discrimination. Now, the other piece that I wanted to point out is, from our research, we found that the most powerful protective variable, so when we look at Islamophobia and what protects you against it, what makes you the least likely to hold anti-Muslim views, and this might surprise people, and maybe people will push back, but according to the empirical data, the most powerful variable against Islamophobic views is knowledge of Islam. It's not knowing a Muslim. It's not even having a close Muslim friend. That will help, but it is not as powerful of a protective factor as knowing about the faith itself. And so I find that very interesting, because we have so far moved away from that. Generally, we don't want to talk about religion. Nobody wants, let's just get to know each other as people. And that's great. Mm-hmm. And it is a protective factor, but far more powerful is actually knowing what the faith teaches. And it makes sense, because we all have the friend who is the exception, right, to the rule. Oh, well, Muslims are some kind of way, but you're the exception. But when you learn about what binds Muslim to each other, which is their faith, it's much harder to make that kind of exception when you just have a close friend.
Dalia, that's a major headline to me. As somebody who's been pushing the knowing a Muslim is the greatest predictor of somebody's attitudes, that takes us back to some new work, or some renewed work, if you will. Okay, am I allowed to ask one more question before we go to audience? I'm looking at my team, which you can't see. Okay, good. Okay, so the final question for me is, at least half of our audience today, I believe, are members of the Jewish community, the Jewish faith, self-identified Jews. That's what I'm trying to say. What is the most important thing for Jewish people, or to understand regarding Islamophobia? What do you want Jews to think about as we have this conversation?
Well, I think one of the most important things for members of the Jewish community to understand is the link between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. It is incredibly strong. They are two branches on one tree of bigotry. And I say that because I just told you that the most powerful protective factor against Islamophobic views is knowing about Islam. I didn't tell you the most predictive of Islamophobia. And that is the one factor that is the strongest predictor of Islamophobic views is anti-Semitic views. Mm-hmm. So if someone admits to anti-Semitic views, they are 34 times as likely to also have Islamophobic views. And it's more powerful than any other factor. So these, and it's interesting because anti-Black racism is also strongly linked to Islamophobia, but anti-Semitism is even stronger than that, even stronger than anti-Black racism. So all of these different bigotries really stem from a common source, and Islamophobia being allowed to thrive or be normalized will never happen in isolation. It will always mean that other forms of bigotry are growing right along with it.
So I would just, I wasn't sure if I was needed. I would also add, I think I'm obviously, as someone who teaches religion, I'm excited that religious literacy is the antidote to bias. And I would kind of just further nuance what Dalia is saying is that it's not just religious literacy in Islam and reading books about Muslims, but to make sure there's an aspect of religion that's lived religion, and to understand and to hear and learn about Muslims from Muslims. I think that what can happen is very often I'll meet people. I went to give a lecture at a university, and very nicely, a person that was part of the committee that had asked me to come speak said, I have some books for you. They're about Islam. And I said, oh, well, thank you. So then they gave me these books that were very much the trope. There's a genre of books written by women it's a very kind of sensationalized view of Islam and their perspective without any kind of religious literacy, any citation, any research. And I thought it was so interesting because they were written about Muslims and not by Muslims. So I just want to point that out. And in fact, there are some people that often have names that sound like they're Muslim. The market asks for that, native informants, but in fact, the literature that they write or what they say is Islamophobic. So I want us to be really careful when we think about learning about Islam to make sure that, first of all, you're engaging the diversity of Muslims in the United States. We are one of the most racially, ethnically, linguistically diverse communities in the United States. I'm contextualizing it in the US to understand if you know one community, it doesn't mean you know all of them. So start locally, get to know the Muslims in your neighborhood, get to know the history of Islam in your neighborhood. It's probably far older than you realize. And as I mentioned, just to make sure that you're learning from Muslims about Muslims and not about Muslims from others. And this is really, I wanted to point that out because some of the most well-funded or highest kind of the ones that show up when you're searching, I'm not a computer scientist, my 17-year-old would be like, Mom, let me tell you the right terminology. That have the highest rankings on Islam are actually not websites that are promoting an accurate perspective on Islam or Muslims. And so I just wanted to encourage people to understand that it is about learning about Muslims, and it is about understanding the vast diversity, nationalities, and communities that comprise the Muslim community. And I would also say that, speaking particularly as an immigrant Muslim, that there have been a lot of parallels for my engagement when I was a nonprofit director, mentorship by people from Jewish organizations, Jewish communities that offered me kind of my community's 30 or 40 years behind in our migration story to the US, and then some of the communities that I was working with. And so there is something particular about being religious minorities in what has historically been a country established on Christian calendar, that there are many possibilities and spaces of collaboration and engagement, and not allowing what we're fed about each other's communities to be the place that we start and stop, but to go beyond that and to make the effort, and to understand that Muslims, while we face Islamophobia, our institutions, some of them are newer. Some of our community groups are not, I'm speaking here for immigrant Muslim communities, are newer. We don't have the same, there's an asymmetry of organizational capacity, of funding. We're working a lot on Muslim philanthropy right now and building out and finding out foundations and their giving and the number of Muslim organizations and the kinds of grants they get are far less than their religious counterparts. So I wanted to point out it's also a question of resources, and that allyship isn't just about, I think, conversations and relationships. It's possibly about being able to offer perspectives and solidarity in ways and show up for each other. And I think that does take a risk. I wanted to be really clear here too. There are risks to stand up for Muslims. There are going to be costs standing up with or for Muslims. And I think that's part of the honest conversation today. I don't know what they are for people on this call. I don't know what they are for individuals, but sometimes our own families may not be supportive of those views and those perspectives. So I wanted to point that out too, that that's real. And in the work that NewGround has done, I think that's been a lot of offering community to what does it mean to stand up for a human rights perspective, that maybe you may lose something in that process. And I think that's a question for everyone to think about too.
Thank you. Okay, so I get to ask one audience question, and audience, I hope that this is the the encapsulation of so many different ideas that are coming up. But one person submitted a question that starts with a nice "at the end of the day" phrase. So let's go with the "at the end of the day" question. At the end of the day, what is the biggest thing you want to accomplish regarding Islamophobia and hate? Like, what's the goal, right? Like, what's the practical? What is the thing that we want to accomplish? And what, for folks listening in, what is our highest order of need? Whew. Mm-hmm.
I can start. I mean, I'll repeat the vision for my organization, which is an America where Muslims are thriving and equal. That's really it. Thriving and equal, meaning they're able to fulfill their highest potential without discrimination from the government or from other, from their peers, from society, from their coworkers. And they're treated with equality. And so it's never about asking for favors, it's about asking for fairness in the judicial system, in immigration, in law enforcement, in banking, in healthcare, in employment. That's it. To be safe in your masjid, to not be collectively blamed for an act that you had nothing to do with and in fact harmed you more than anyone else. So I guess an America where Muslims are thriving and equal is what we're trying to accomplish here.
I mean, clarification, Dalia, on an earlier point you made. Somebody asked a question about whether the inverse is true about the connection between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So meaning, is anti-Semitism a predictor of Islamophobia in the same way that,
I mean, in fact, it is, anti-Semitism is a predictor of Islamophobia. Now, is Islamophobia a predictor of anti-Semitism? I guess that's the question. And the answer is I actually don't know, because we always look at Islamophobia. I mean, that's just our work as the outcome we're studying. And we look at variables that predict it. And anti-Semitism was the strongest predictor in that study.
Thank you for that. Najeeba?
So I would say, one thing I really think about is, what does it mean, whether it's Islamophobia or any other form of bias, what does it mean to be able to walk into a room and not have to be exceptional and not have to be perfect and not have to be the best example of, this is how I was raised. And I don't mind the spiritual message of ihsan, of excellence in our carrying of ourselves in the world, but for it to be imposed by an external kind of pressure that we feel we can't mess up. We can't, if we do one thing, it's going to take the whole community down. I'm just sharing with you some of the realities and the pressures that exist. And I think they exist for people who experience other biases and forms of racism. So I think, what does it mean to be in a world where thriving is not even a question, where the beginning of an identity isn't, well, how do I be so perfect that they can't question me, that they can't, that they can't take me down, or that they, whatever that might be. So what does it mean to just be average? It would be nice to just be average. I know that seems really simple, but it would be lovely, right? I'm just putting that out there. I think in terms of things of the highest order, I just wanted to share with you, my best friend in high school was named Brooke Rubenstein. I don't know where she is now. I think she's still back in DC. She was Jewish, or is Jewish, and I'm Muslim, and she was sober because of her journey with not for a religious reason, but for another reason, and I didn't drink. So we became kind of this pair that didn't get to go to parties, which I didn't care about. There was no alcohol. We used to hike. So don't tell anyone, but we used to, in our senior year, skip the last period and go hiking. So my kids were like, what did you do that was bad? Mom was like, oh, I would go hiking. And, that's what Muslim, I guess, kids in Northern Virginia in the 90s did. But there's something really about that friendship where she showed up for me and I showed up for her. And I think what's really important is less about just Islam or Muslims, and understanding wherever and whatever access we have, looking around the room at who's at the table and ask that question, who's missing? Who's not here? And then the second question is, do I even know who's missing? And what do I need to learn more about so I can even understand who's missing? So I would just ask us, whenever we have access, and it doesn't have to be just particularly for Muslims, but I think just asking that table in the rooms that we're in, who's there and who's missing, and what do I need to learn more about, and how do I make that invitation? Don't wait till there is violence at the mosque, just as we shouldn't wait till there's violence at the synagogue. Make relationships in times of peace, because as someone who does crisis intervention around the world, it's so tough to build relationships when there has already been trauma that has happened. So how do we show up for each other when there isn't an urgent issue that's threatening all of us? Is there a moral imperative, whether it's from the Quran, ta'arafu, to learn and know about one another? What is your spiritual and religious grounding that says, I need to get to know my neighbor? What is that for you? So that you're doing it not just because there's discrimination, because we hear and we see sincerity and genuineness. So how do we engage and learn from our own theological, spiritual, and ideological basis? And I think, just in addition to thinking about who's in the room, is what resources do I have where I can reallocate power, resources, and other forms to people who don't have access? And you would be surprised how often people need help, but they're not ready to ask. So offering and making that invitation, not I'm going to show up for you, but how should I show up for you? And I think asking that question is an incredible way to work with all kinds of communities. That's it. I'll stop here.
Thank you. And thank you both. The what do we do about it is often the hardest question, because there are ways, there are avenues, and we also need innovators. We need change makers to continue to think of new ways to confront these issues and problems. And as we started earlier by talking about youth, both our own children and young Muslims today, and their own connection to their faith, which is among the most deeply compromised relationships and one of the biggest costs of Islamophobia, both to human life and to to human flourishing, in order to have self-acceptance and self-pride. It's what all of our kids deserve, right? And that we deserved too. And I can say that I can relate on knowing more about the verses I needed in order to defend Islam, having those memorized much more than the verses that I needed in order to nourish my own heart and soul. And so if there are young Muslims, young Jews who are tuned in here tonight, we invite you to join us and to be part of a community where you can thrive, where you can flourish, where you can learn more about your faith, your identity, and your future together alongside other Muslims and Jews from here in Los Angeles. Muslim and Jewish Angelinos, we've got a lot in common, like in most cities, and it's not just the Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, but so much of our faith traditions that hold the traditions within our faiths that hold us together. So as we conclude, I want to thank you, Najeeba and Dalia, for joining us on a much later time on your parts of the country. And I also want to acknowledge and express such gratitude for the fact that hard conversations are often the most helpful, and being candid and personal is not a requirement in our jobs, but it helps people understand our positions better. So I thank you for bringing your full self to this conversation. We're also grateful for the additional tools and ways of thinking that you equipped us with. So now for those who wish to stay and engage in more interactive conversations, we're going to go into breakout sessions for up to 30 minutes. But before we do that, and I tell you how that's going to work, and before some of you log off because you don't want to join, I want to also remind you that you are invited to apply for the NewGround Fellowship. We have a high school program that's called MAGIC, Muslims and Jews Inspiring Change, and we also have an adult fellowship that doesn't have a class or a fun name like our youth program. Leave it to the youth to name themselves in a cool way. And both of those are on a semi-academic track or timeline, meaning that they in the fall and they go through the spring. The applications for the high school program are already done, quite honestly. But if you've got somebody who's dying to join, I'm going to go outside of process and say, send them over, get in touch, and we'll see. If not for this cohort, then the next one. And then secondly, for the adult fellowship, the application deadline is September 8th, and you can visit mjnewground.org, to find the application and all of the details. And we really hope that, for those of you who are outside of Los Angeles, this is a program for Angelinos. We are focused on our city and building relationships and intersectional community that shares values. And so we invite you to reach out and be in touch with us. Follow us on social media. You're already doing that if you heard about this. If you would like to get involved and learn more about how to do stuff like this in your city, our team are incredible advisors and mentors when it comes to that. Aziza and Andrea, Tasneem, and the whole entire team. So that's my push. And so if you are staying, and we really hope you will, there's 71 of you still logged in. If you are staying for some conversation, if we got you going and now you want to talk, here's how it's going to work. You will be randomly put into a small discussion group with a skilled facilitator. So you will not be hanging out there on your own. And they will facilitate a conversation for up to the next 30 minutes. And once the conversation is completed, even if it's not 30 minutes, you will then be automatically logged out. So on behalf of our staff, board, and volunteers, we want to thank our guests and all of you for joining us for this important forum. Thank you. May the blessings of God, our Creator, be upon every single one of you. And may our Creator help us to fight the scourge of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and achieve the kind of human flourishing that we have talked about here. So again, thank you all and thank you both. And please stick around for those breakout rooms.